Usually with somebody giving a series like this, the first one has a certain crowd and number of people there, and invariably the second one, the numbers drop off by about 40%, and you don't see that 40% again. So I'm very grateful you're all here again. So you've got a full house again, and it's good to be back with you. And if you're interested, don't be intimidated by the size of this book. This book moves from one thing to another. It's not going to bore you. It's not going to weigh you down. It's called Jesus Disfigured. My wife gave me that title for the book. My description, exposing the Gnostic Gospels, covers the whole history of Gnosticism, all of the Gospels I've been talking about here, and it covers the defense of our scriptures. It's the longest chapter in my book, and then finishes with a chapter on the Gospel of John. If you're interested, they're 200 Rand. And you can get one off me if you want it. All right, the famous or the infamous, depends how you look at it, Gospel of Thomas. That's the book in the series. Showed you the one on the Apocrypha of John last week. You want to have a look at it afterward to see what it's like, you're welcome to do so. Right, well, we have only one known codex, one text of the Gospel of Thomas in existence. The book was known for a long time in the early years of the Christian faith, but it was only when the Nag Hammadi texts, the ones I told you about last time, when they were discovered in 1945, that we finally got a full text of the Gospel of Thomas. Hippolytus and Origen, they were 3rd century famous Christian leaders. Both of them knew about the Gospel of Thomas. They commented on it and so on. But other than that, hardly anybody else knew about it in those days. Irenaeus, who was the guy who wrote the 2-volume work against heresies, mainly against agnostics, doesn't mention the Gospel of Thomas. And that Irenaeus did his writings around AD 180. It's an almost certain hint that the book wasn't written until at least AD 180. The author claims to be Judas Thomas the Twin. That's the title, meaning, the Thomas Didymus of the Gospels. And not only that, but having been found at Nag Hammadi, in the whole text, it's sandwiched between, I think it's the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of something else. You get known by the company you keep, as somebody once said. And this is where this book was found. It's not a book, it's, as you say, it looks long, but it's not. It's actually quite short. And it was, having been found among all those other Gnostic texts, there's little doubt that it was a Gnostic text. A lot of people today are trying to, build up a case for, standing room only for latecomers. Now I've lost my track. Yeah. When today, many people, many writers, you've got all sorts of books coming out from all over the world, mainly in America, where they're trying to make out that this is as good an original gospel as the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. This is the one that gets punted all the time as, in all probability, a valid alternative gospel which helps you to see the story of Jesus and everything else in different lights, helps you to get a bigger perspective and so on. And they write a lot of nonsense because this gospel is nothing like the originals we've got. It's a very short book. It's not a narrative like all the other 3 are, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's mainly just full of sayings. It's got, I think it's 134 sayings, and every one is them of Jesus. Jesus said. This is one of the few Gnostic Gospels Gnostic texts overall, where Jesus is mentioned by name. But this one mentions him all the time. Some of these sayings, a lot of them, are common biblical sayings. We know Jesus said them, but then, and I'll give you an example or two, but then they got reinterpreted, rewritten in agnostic context. very cleverly done. Others are sayings attributed to him that we've never heard of before. And so you've got here a threat to the New Testament corpus, the four canonical Gospels. The reason why they tried to bring it together is because if they can prove that this is an alternative gospel, if they can satisfy the known world that this is a fifth gospel, then it'll change the picture completely, and there'll be all sorts of talk about whether the other gospels are authentic or not. And some of them try hard to pull the date down to about 50 AD, which is about 17 years after Jesus' resurrection. As early as that, just because they say, well, you see, it's got a lot of sayings of Jesus, they're much simpler, they're in a simpler form and slightly different, but you see, this may be the original text, and the other Gospels are more elaborate and so on, and they look like they've been embellished as time has gone along. Well, there's no evidence for that, no evidence for it at all. As I said, not one text of the Gospel of Thomas was ever heard of. The Christian church never knew about it till the 3rd century. Hippolytus and Origen were 3rd century Christian scholars, and they're the first ones who mention it. But what you find with these critical scholars, what they try to do is they try to nudge the Gospel of Thomas into the 2nd century, all sorts of arguments why it could have been written 80, 50 more. And then they start going the other way with the canonical Gospels. They try and, bring them and push them out and into a later date and try and show that this book may well have come out at the same time or even earlier than the other ones. But just like the Apocryphon we looked at last week, you find that in other extracts we had, I think there are 2 Greek extracts about that length of the quotations from the Gospel of Thomas. These were the only ones that were known for a long time, but they're written in Greek. The one we've got now, the Gospel of Thomas, is written in Coptic. But these 2 Greek texts had so many slight changes, so many variations from the current Gospel of Thomas that we have, just like the Apocryphon last time, that it's obvious that the Gnostics thought nothing about changing the text as they went along. They'd write it out, somebody would invent it, and because the guy who wrote it forged it in the first place, you don't see any problem with reforging it, and trying to prove it. And this is exactly what they did. And it is found, as I said, right next to the Gospel of Philip, which is a clear Gnostic text. I'll be talking on that next week. And it's what we would call a wisdom gospel. It's just the wisdom mind of Jesus, that Gnostic guru image of him, the great philosopher, the wisdom guy sitting in a cave. You just see the little 2 white eyes spinning out all sorts of mouths of wisdom. There's nothing else. There's no miracles in this book, no exorcism, no prophetic foresight, no apocalyptic character to the book. Everything else that we find in our Gospels is not here. Just teachings, just sayings. And one of the reasons why people like this is because many years ago, the idea was invented that the only reliable portions of the Gospels are from Matthew and Luke, which are teachings of Jesus, sayings of him, like the Sermon on the Mount. It appears in Matthew and in a less shorter form in Luke. It doesn't appear in any other gospel. And anti-Christian scholars for a long time have been trying to sort of whittle down the canonical gospels. And I'll get back to it in a few minutes when I just show you how. And the whole argument is that the only 2 things that we can trust are the teachings of Jesus, which are common to both Luke and to Matthew. And they believe that an original text existed, which they call the Q text. Q is German for Quelle, which means source. So this is the source of these texts, and they believe there was a common text to the Gospels of Luke and Matthew behind all those 2 Gospels, and that got elaborated and embellished and changed into our Gospels, which we have today. In my book, you find it very easy to knock this idea of a Q manuscript over. It's quite easy to do, and I've done that. And there's really no evidence, no authentic evidence anywhere for this book other than that it was written as a Gnostic text sometime after 180 AD. Also, you find, as sort of half mentioned already, that the sayings in here have been softened. They've been limited. They've become fairly bland. You'll see that when I come to one of them. Whereas in the scriptures, the Christian Gospels are just charged with authority, charged with other things like that. They're authoritative. They have apocalyptic background to them. Jesus himself, his challenge to the world, got him into serious trouble. As I read somewhere, somebody said no Gnostic guy would ever have got himself into that kind of trouble with the Romans. They always wanted to avoid it. They used to think that Christians who were prepared to be martyred for their faith were crazy. They said no need for that, because they knew themselves that their texts were not historically genuine. They were composed, they were compiled, they were forged, and they knew that. So again, that brings the point. If your originals are forged, you get out of them what you can, change them if you like. Nothing like that has ever happened to the four Gospels. They have been very carefully preserved, intact, and there's no evidence from anything in the first century, right up to AD 100, even into the second century, that you can bring up against the four canonical Gospels and try and disprove them. All right. And also, as I say, you find in, like most Gnostic texts, it's always mystical and it's always cryptic. They always tell you need this gnosis, this knowledge, without ever telling you what that knowledge is. Apparently the people who get it know they've got it, and then they secret and they don't tell anybody else. They tell everybody else they've got to get it, but they don't tell them what it is or how to get it. Also in the Gospel of Thomas, there are no titles of Jesus. Son of God, Son of Man, the Messiah, the Christ. Not one title given to Jesus in the book. Peter is described as a just messenger, Matthew in the book as a wise philosopher, and so on. Peter is saying this about Jesus, that he was just a messenger, nothing more. And Matthew says he's just a philosopher. In the book, Jesus asks his disciples, he says, who do you think that I am? That's Matthew 16. But this time it's not you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, not at all. This time Peter says to him, you're a just messenger, honest, upright, just a sort of prophetic figure. And Matthew says, no, you're a wise philosopher. In other words, you're a good Gnostic. But Thomas says, my mouth cannot say what you are like. And, that makes him now elevated. He's getting up into the clouds. He's heading for Gnosis because he can't tell Jesus what he's like. and now they attribute this book to him. And you find the same thing, I think it's in one of the other books, Gospel of Judas is exactly the same, where Judas says to Jesus, I'm unable to describe you for what you really are. Can't put it in words. Oh, now this Gospel of Judas tells you he was the enlightened one and so on. It's amazing. Enlightenment goes with ignorance. You don't quite know how they make sense of that, but they do. All right, I'm going to show you some of these sayings, teachings. One of them goes like this. Jesus, always the speaker. Show me the stone, and I will show you the cornerstone. Now, Matthew 21:42, what Jesus actually said was the very stone which has become the cornerstone has become the head of the corner. That's the principle that is put out in Jesus himself. Stone the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. That's from the Psalms, and Jesus attributed that to himself. The Jews rejected their Messiah when he came, and he's become the cornerstone of eternity. So that's a pretty dramatic statement. But when you turn around and look at the Gnostic reinversion of it, show me the stone and I'll show you the cornerstone. See, vague as can be, it doesn't tell you which stone, how, why, what the cornerstone is, what the impact is, but somehow the Gnostic in his wisdom and up in the clouds there, somehow he knows what Jesus was talking about. But that's how that book does it all the time. Takes away the impact of the biblical sayings of Jesus and just waters them down to wisdom sayings with nothing that you can connect them to half the time. Just up in the air, and the more secretive, the more obscure it becomes, the more enlightened the guy who comes up with it. That's the sort of image that they had. Anyway, here comes another one. Listen to this, and then straight out of Gospel of Thomas. If you fast, you will bring sin upon yourselves. If you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give to charity, you will harm your spirits. Now that is devilish. That's right against everything Jesus ever said. This is actually blasphemy to put these words in his mouth. But what the guy, the great Gnostic behind this was thinking is probably this. They didn't like fasting. No, you have your mysticism, you have your trances or whatever, but they didn't like fasting. They didn't like praying, and they didn't like having to look after other people. And so they invent talks like these that tell them, you're only there for your own welfare. Don't worry about anybody else. Funny enough, we're not quite sure why it does this, but it talks of James the Just. This is the brother of Jesus, famous brother who was martyred in AD 62. He wasn't a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, like his other brothers weren't. But afterwards, he became well known in the church, especially in Jerusalem. He was actually the most prominent Christian figure there. But now, this book makes Jesus say, no matter where you have come from, you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. It doesn't tell you why. I mean, that doesn't tell you anything about him. Gnosticism always presumes that the readers know who it's talking about, because it shows how much the Christian faith was impacting early, second century world. But I mean, it doesn't make sense. James the Just, all heaven and earth were built for him alone. Doesn't make sense. No doubt, if you know that extra knowledge, it makes sense to you, but I wouldn't know how. Here comes another one. When you know yourselves, then you will be known. But if you do not know yourselves, then you dwell in poverty, and you are poverty. And that's a gnosis statement down the line. It's what's up here. It's a super spiritual, mystical knowledge. And as long as you've got that, you are fine. If you haven't, you're just in poverty. You may as well not have a mind at all. You may as well just be a zombie. And then you get this one. I love this one. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. I love that saying. I'll tell you why now. But just let me read it again. If you bring forth what is deep within you, that will save you. So in other words, you don't go looking for a savior or anything else. You just search the inside of your own mind and body, and away you go. But I want to quote this verse to you and then comment on it. This is Jesus speaking. But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, from within. And this defiles a man. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. This is what happens when what is within us rises to the surface. It's a direct contrast to what that text is saying and what is put into the mouth of Jesus. When it says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. Jesus is saying, you bring forth what is within you. You're going to get yourself and probably other people, giving them a lot of trouble and getting yourself into serious trouble. But one of the fascinating things about the Gospel of Thomas is this book. How many of you have heard of the Jesus Seminar? Oh, never heard of it. Well, Jesus Seminar is in America. It's a lot of top so-called scholars, people with PhDs from universities and things, who formed the Jesus Seminar as an intention of trying to find who the historical Jesus might have been, the real one, the natural one, whoever he was. Everybody acknowledges that Jesus existed. In fact, even Bart Ehrman, who I've told you about him before, he's probably the most prominent anti-Christian writer in the world today. But he wrote a book, Did Jesus Exist? And he hit back at some people who are further to the left than he is. And he said to them, of course Jesus existed. Nobody can deny that. And coming here, that's what the Jesus Seminar was setting itself the purpose of doing. Founded by Robert Funk and Roy Hoover in 1985. But it's called the Five Gospels. You got any idea what the five Gospels are? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Thomas. Look at the size of this book. It's a huge commentary on all of them. And it's not commenting on the text. It's not like a Christian commentary. This is just all the evidence one way or the other that they think is there for who the original Jesus must have been. And I've told you this before when I gave my introduction in the church, but I have to give it to you again, that what they did was that they decided that the best way to find out who Jesus really was to vote for one thing or another, put it on the ballot. So they then said, all right, what we're going to do, they gave to each scholar, they got all these guys like themselves together, top scholars and whatever, and they gave them a red pen, a pink pen, a grey pen, and a black pen. And they said, any saying of Jesus that you think is genuine in the Gospels gets red. Any saying that is possibly or probably genuine gets pink. Any saying that you're hesitant about, you think probably not, gets grey. And then, no, he never said it. Absolute nonsense. That's black. The Gospels of Mark and the Gospels of John in this book are virtually black throughout. I think in Mark there may be one saying of Jesus that's included. If I show you the book from here, if you want to, I'll pass it around, you can have a look at it. You won't find, you battle to find pink or red anywhere. Look at this. Just look at this. Hardly, I haven't spotted it yet. Haven't spotted one. There's one. There's a pink. Good luck to it. There's a red. Wow. Yeah. But that's how it is. This book, 90% of this book is written off. But a number, and as I say, Mark and John's Gospel are written off. Out of Matthew come a few, and out of Luke come a few, and out of the Gospel of Thomas come a number as well. But the interesting thing is, all of them are sayings of Jesus that fit into that Q pattern. So virtually what these guys are saying is, the only authentic text about Jesus is this mythical Q that they think must have been written long ago. A lot of top scholars in the world think this. They honestly think that there was a Q text, and they've got no evidence for it, none whatsoever. But there was a Q text common to the teaching of Matthew and Luke that coincided, and everything else is unreliable. So here in this book, that's what you've got. And it's a whole book. Look at the size of it. It's about 700 pages long. And sorry. Yeah. And just quote to you what two American, not companies, but whatever they are, Ecumenical Trends, that's the name of an association in America, says, this volume, this 5 Gospels, is filled with discoveries, surprises, and rich treasures. I don't know, 90% of the canonical Gospels are written off in it. Another one says, Christian social action, telling you to watch out for them. One of the most significant religious books ever published, this one. Significant, and it writes off 80-90% of the 4 Gospels. John just written off, nothing unusual in that. Mark written off, that's a bit unusual. But Mark is the original narrative of Jesus' life. There's not much teaching in Mark here and there, but very little. John's Gospel, it's got a lot of teaching, but it's very different to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So it's only in Matthew and Luke that you find these sort of teachings, these sayings of Jesus. And that's the only things that they think are authentic. Now, this book is a New York bestseller, New York Times bestseller. It means in America, it's been bought out by thousands and thousands of people. And they get hold of this thing and they ask themselves the question on the front, what did Jesus really say? The search for the authentic words of Jesus. And Elaine Pagels, who's not one of my favorite authors, says it's bold and fascinating. Well, we'd like something that's genuine and authentic, man. Not bold and fascinating. All right. We're going well with time today. Good. Last thing. And ladies, just bear with me on this. This is not deliberately directed at you. You want to blame anybody? Blame the guy who wrote the Gospel of Thomas. There's a sting in the tail of this book for all these people who try to advocate the Gospel of Thomas as an authentic text, possibly the most authentic text there is. It's got one verse, verse 134, right at the bottom. One of the things that you find, like Elaine Pagel, she's a prize example, is that with these modern movements that rely on Gnostic texts and others, there's a tremendous amount of feminism, lifting up, the female to every possible form of equality with males and so on. And that you find in all these books that are written by these kind of people. Elaine Pagels is a prize example, and there are so many others. But here comes the problem for them. Sorry, I just see this. Haven't got my reading glasses on. The focus of the Gospels of Mary applies here. Focus on them. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? And that is something that we will see next week and the week after when we look at the Gospels of Philip and Mary. And those Gospels are what they love, because this is where they pump up the feminism. That Mary Magdalene, I mentioned to you before, was the ultimate disciple of Jesus. In the Gospel of Mary, she asks him 83 wisdom questions, whereas the other disciples don't ask her more than 3 or 4, and so on. And she's the wisdom, the symbol of wisdom. And in some areas, you've even got people writing books that she and Jesus together, Jesus probably married to Mary Magdalene, you've heard that. This is a common thing as well. So she gets boosted up a lot. And that's what, they are pushing everywhere. And if you read the Gospel of Thomas, you don't see much of it, but you would think that it's supportive of that position. But the last verse of this Gospel of Thomas reads as follows. Simon Peter said to them, Mary should leave us, for females are not worthy of life. Jesus said, look, I shall guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter heaven's kingdom. Straight out of the Gospel of Thomas. Well, that's the end of feminism with this book, that I can tell you. But, sorry, ladies, but at least you've learned something. I put in my book after that quote, I said, and thus endeth the Gospel of Thomas. Yeah, it's a blow to the feminine, based entirely on the Gnostic idea that the all in all was neutral until he saw the image of himself. Remember, in a mirror, I told you last week. And he didn't think any of it. He remained neutral. But she wanted to know, that wanted to know what its own image was. Who am I? And from that came Barbilo, the female, and the male and the female. But all Gnostic texts treated that this brought the image of God down. In the Bible, it's Adam and Eve who pull the relationship with God down. In Gnostic texts, it's the father figure himself who's pulled down because of the female. And this permeates a whole lot of Gnostic texts. I'm going to just mention to you at the end in closing. But this is one of the things that has caused a lot of havoc among all the writers who are trying to prove that the Gospel of Thomas is an authentic text, especially in the light of the feminist movement, over Europe and America. They're not finding themselves too popular. Yeah. Anyway, Marvin Mayer, who was the one who did the original Gnostic Bible, put it together, his comments, he says, the Gospel of Thomas ends with a shock. Also it does. Bart Ehrman says, it has caused a good bit of consternation. This is just humor for you folk. When we come to the sale of the Gospel of Judas, you'll get a bit more humor as well. But there are huge efforts to bypass this blemish. And some scholars have said, no, this text is not complete. This is a guy called Mabry. He says that the text is incomplete. Somebody has removed the first half of the text. And he says, I believe, I believe, no evidence. I believe the original version went on to read, and any male who makes himself female will likewise enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, very convenient. That's what he says. He says, no, he says this text has been butchered. Half of the other half is missing. He says a celibate male scribe must have deleted it. Now you go the other way around to Davies, the guy who I think authored that book there, and he comes to the opposite conclusion. He doesn't say, something was taken away from it. He says nothing was deleted from the text. The whole verse has simply been added to it. He says, no, somebody went and just added that in. You see, it's at the bottom of the book. Tells you somebody just scraped it in somewhere just to, undermine the gospel text. Whatever the truth is, it's a thorn in the flesh for people who are using this gospel. You ever hear anybody raise it up and tell you what, that this gospel of Thomas, don't you know it, what it's all about, just remember this. Just tell the guy, go and read the last verse in the book and just see what it says. The thing is that this idea, this hasn't been interpolated. This idea that the female has to become male to enter the kingdom of heaven was held to commonly by Roman and Greek philosophers. They held a common view that the female was secondary to the male by a long shot. Philo, well-known Jewish philosopher from North Africa, 3rd century, said, "For progress is indeed nothing else but the giving up of the female gender by changing into the male. Females are passive and emotional, whereas males are rational, etc." Now, you probably got taught at school, little girls are made of sugar and spice, and little boys, frogs and dog's tails and things. Well, this is the reverse of it, Thanks to you guys, we've finally got something we can work on here. Yeah, but Philo wasn't agnostic. He was a Jewish philosopher, but this was a common belief across North Africa and Europe as well, that the female was secondary. And again, he believed it, that she's got to give up the female gender and must change into the male. Nobody's ever told us, quite how to do that. I know they can do it today, but I don't think they could do anything like that, spiritually, physically, mystically, or whatever in those days. The whole problem is that in those days, what to us today, we call women the fairest sex, they treated the woman as the weakest sex. And that was the whole difference. And that's what permeated Roman and Greek thinking and got a foothold at the bottom of this gospel. And the funny thing is that there are a number of Gnostic texts that advocate this division. A number of them, not just the Gospel of Thomas. And don't take offense of this. I never wrote this. This comes back from 1800 years ago. This statement is attributed to Jesus. The first one comes from the first revelation of James. They use Christian names for their books freely. First revelation of James. And Jesus said, "The perishable has gone up to the imperishable, and the work of females has attained to the work of this maleness." There's the whole theme, the whole principle again. Then you get another one, Zostrianus, famous person from those days, mystical. "The virgin light has come up to Protophanes, the great male perfect mind." I don't think my wife thinks I've got the perfect mind. I try to convince her occasionally, but it doesn't help. And then again, another saying attributed to Jesus. He tells us, "Pray in the place where there is no woman," meaning destroy the works of the female. This was a serious thing, the way people thought in those days. Yeah. You know how long the Catholics still don't put women in the pulpit. You can see the impact. You can just see the influence of it. It's been there for centuries. And then the last one, which is Zostrianus again. I love this one. "Flee the madness and bondage of femininity and choose for yourselves the salvation of masculinity." Yeah. And all of that comes out of the Gospels, the so-called books of the Gnostic texts. These are all Nag Hammadi texts, every single one of them that I've quoted from. So it was a fundamental principle. And this is why they put down, the funny thing though is that in spite of this, when it comes to Mary Magdalene, they beefed her up. And so do the Catholics. Mary Magdalene's got a credible history and image in Catholic, mythical stories and things over the years. It's a subject in itself. But you can see from here just how all Gnostic texts are not divinely inspired. There's nothing here, nothing in the Gospel of Thomas to possibly credit it, nothing. They are just things that people pump out of their minds, put into writing, and expect other people to believe them. And in those days, and I suppose today it's the same, people are foolish enough to do so.